Hi, my name is Christina Jamison and welcome to the School of Home Ownership. We are currently doing a series on advice worth its weight in gold. Our first one is conveyancing. I'd like to welcome Janet Christopher, who is our solicitor. Welcome.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for having me.
So when you're looking at buying a property, you found a house that you want to buy, what do? Well, we go to Janet. Can you take us through the process?
The first three things that I always tell people that come and approach me about buying a property is, do you have your pre-approval, your loan pre-approval? Have you done your pest and building strata inspection reports if it's a unit? And have you got the contract, because we need to get that reviewed?
Okay, so when we're reviewing the contract, what things are you looking at?
We're looking at whether the vendor or the seller, in layman's terms, has the ability to transfer the property to you as the purchaser. We're looking at the documents in the contract, the plan, any restrictions or easements, the zoning, whether there's any pipes or anything like that running through the property that may affect what you want to do with it. And we're looking at the terms and conditions that will affect the transfer.
So my favourite one is, when I buy property, is I never want to put a 10% deposit down. So, and Janet does a lot of my conveyancing. So I usually ask, can you make sure that they accept a 5% deposit? That's my favourite one. But what's some interesting stories of people not getting their contract reviewed?
Yes, so I recently had a client who went to an auction without having their contract reviewed. Unfortunately for them, there was a term in the contract that meant that they had to pay $25,000 in addition to the purchase price. And that was because there was a clause in the contract that required a land tax adjustment, and there was just no way for them to be able to get out, because if you buy a property at auction, Christine, there's no cooling off period and you just can't get out of the contract for any reason.
So if I can just explain to people land tax. So people that own property and it's an investment property are expected to pay a land tax. So in this case, it wasn't the poor person that's going to buy this property has ended up paying that tax for somebody else. So that's pretty horrific.
That's right. So they've contributed to that land tax when they probably needn't have, because it was not going to be liable for land tax in their hands. But because of that term in the contract that they weren't aware of, they had no option but to continue with that purchase and pay that additional amount. Had they had their contract reviewed beforehand, then they may have been able to decide that they weren't going to go to the contract, or perhaps couch their offer or bid, taking that into consideration.
So at least they would have been well informed. And
we could have attempted to negotiate that clause be removed in the same way that you mentioned the 5% deposit, that we could have attempted to make a request that a 5% deposit be paid instead of a 10% deposit.
Okay, and if we go back one step, you're talking about auction. So what's the difference? What type of purchasing can we actually do?
So when you go to auction, there's no cooling off period, and you basically become liable from the moment that hammer falls if you're the highest bidder. You can also buy property outside of auction conditions in what's usually called a private treaty, where you make your offer, the agent sort of takes that to the seller, and if that's agreed, then contracts are exchanged. In that situation, you're likely to have a cooling off period, which is 5 business days. During that time, you can pull out of the contract for any reason. However, you won't get back 0.25% of the purchase price. That'll be forfeited to the seller.
So that's the risk. You lose your 0.25%, but as you said, you've done your due diligence and you're not exposed to the risk.
Correct. And a lot of people use the cooling off period to do their due diligence, so their pest and building reports or their strata inspection reports, and they use that time to also get their formal loan approval, because as I said at the beginning, my advice being make sure you have at least pre-approval as a minimum. Now, most banks won't give you formal or unconditional approval without a contract being signed. So when you have a cooling off period, you're at an advantage because you can then use that time to make sure you will get your formal loan approval and not have to delay settlement or be in trouble when you get to the settlement point because you can't finance the purchase.
So what happens, for example, just going on from that, I've put my 0.25% and then I put the remainder of the 5% or 10%, so after the cooling off period, but then I see something go wrong. So for example, I've just changed my mind, there's a flood, the house has been damaged. What happens then? What could go wrong?
Okay, so there's two different things that you mentioned there. Change my mind. You can't change your mind. You don't have any remedy. If you change your mind, no one's going to let you out of that contract. There will be severe penalties that you would have to pay. You also mentioned flood. Now, that's a different thing. So if the property is damaged because of flooding, then the seller can't give you what they promised to sell you and what you agreed to buy. So depending on what the parties want to do, there can be different consequences or scenarios that play out. For instance, both parties can agree on a reduced amount to pay, or the seller can agree to fix everything before a settlement can take place, or the purchaser can just decide that this is not what they agreed to buy and have potentially an option to pull out.
Okay, so there was a famous case a fair few years back now. It was a Tony Collette. So from what I understand, she had bought at an auction, so she would have put her 10% down. Then she was going to sell her property. And when she sold her property, it was sold far less than what she had initially thought. So then she wanted to pull out, and she actually didn't go through with it. So she was sued for damages, is that correct? And there was something like $815,000 that she was being sued for. Is that what could happen?
Yes, I'm not familiar with the specific amounts or anything like that in that case, but if you as a purchaser will want to get out of a contract and you don't have a valid reason, then you will be in breach of contract. The seller can keep your deposit, the full 10% deposit, even if you've paid a 5%. They can demand payment of the full 10% and can sue you for breach of contract and claim damages if there are any.
Wow. So we don't want to do that.
No.
So that's where you come in and you tell us, do our due diligence beforehand. Now, what sort of hiccups? So we've done everything right. What sort of hiccups and what things can go wrong?
The most common issue that arises is when we get to settlement and the lender's not ready. And obviously if we don't have money, we can't finalise the settlement. So we have to wait until that can happen. And if we reach the settlement date under the contract and we still haven't got the finance, then we obviously have to wait. But the seller has the right to impose interest and perhaps some other penalties within the contract, one of which is what's called a notice to complete. Now, a notice to complete will give you 14 more days to settle, during which time interest is accruing. And if you haven't settled by the end of that 14 days, then you'll be in breach of contract, and the seller can terminate the contract and keep your 10% deposit.
So we mentioned due diligence. So if you just focus on that when we talked about inspections. So I've done inspections. I've bought a few properties myself, and it can be actually quite overwhelming because there's pages and pages and pages of a builder basically saying everything that could possibly be wrong because they're covering themselves in terms of legal terms. So I basically look at the summary only, and it gives me an idea if it would be considered a good property. There's no major issues. And then basically I just call them and say, just tell me what it is. So I've got a very good building inspection person that I use quite constantly. So what other things would you be looking at or advising your customers?
Christina, the value of getting a pest and building report is unsurmountable. I can't even begin to explain how important that is, and I'm glad that you've pointed that out. In addition to that, though, I always say to my clients, do a thorough inspection yourself. Walk through the property more than a couple of times. It always amazes me how people will spend $2-3 million on a property, but only walk through for 15 minutes before they go to the auction, say, or only do a very quick inspection and not even turn on the lights, for example. So I always say, make sure you go through, check everything yourself, turn on the lights, turn on the dishwasher, turn the taps on, test the remote controls for the garage, because you are taken to have bought that property when you sign that contract in the condition that it is in at that point. Now, you get another inspection, an opportunity to inspect, which is called the final inspection, within 3 days of the settlement. But at that point, you're only really looking to make sure that the property is vacant and that it is in the same condition that it was in when you agreed to buy it. Now, at that point, it's too late to be doing a thorough inspection, because the vendor, the seller, can say to you, that was the condition that particular item, and we usually have a lot of problems with dishwashers, was in when you agreed to buy it, so they won't assist in perhaps giving you compensation, or you won't have any opportunity to delay the settlement or even get out of it. So I can't stress how important it is to do your own thorough inspections in addition to the pest and building reports.
So just a quick point there. So if you bought the property on the condition that you can move into it straight away, you check 2 days before the settlement and they're still in there, you can actually postpone settlement until they...
If you have agreed to buy a property that is vacant, you don't have to settle until that property is vacant.
Purchasing a property is quite stressful. In fact, it's up there in terms of stress of actually losing a spouse. However, when you've got a great team to support you like Janet, building inspectors, mortgage broker, they'll walk you through the process and it will be a lot more simpler for you. Thank you, Janet. And how do people get a hold of you?
Well, conveyancing these days is largely all online and electronic, so you can contact me by going to our website, www.homelawyers.com.au. We service people all over New South Wales, or you can come and visit us here at our office at Cars Park, 7 Carlaw Avenue. We'd love to see you.
Thank you, and thank you for listening. And if you want any more words of wisdom or nuggets of gold, please feel free to go to www.schoolofhomeownership.com.au. Bye.